The execution ground at dawn. The air on Corvath Station's lower yard smells like rust and frost, the particular cold, metallic tang of a world that never quite gets warm even when its single dim sun clears the ridgeline. Frost rimes the razor wire along the perimeter fence in feather patterns that catch the early light and throw it back in dull, colorless glints. Somewhere out past the fence, wind moves through the skeletal remains of a human settlement that used to have a name before the occupation, and the sound it makes threading through broken girders is low and constant, almost like breathing. Boots crunch on frozen gravel as the last of the prisoner rows are herded into place, breath fogging in ragged clouds above heads bowed against the cold. A guard's rifle strap creaks somewhere behind the dais. Far off, past the ridgeline, something that might be an early transport shuttle drones low and steady, the only mechanical sound in a yard otherwise gone silent with the particular held-breath quiet of people who have learned, the hard way, exactly how loudly grief carries on a morning like this one. A crowd has gathered in the yard, human prisoners in rows, flanked by armed Voss'Ka guards in ceremonial half-armor, all of them facing a raised dais where a single figure kneels in chains, wrists bound behind his back, a line of dried blood tracking from his hairline down one cheek. Above the dais, on a balcony carved from the station's original command tower, a young woman in imperial violet watches the yard below with an expression carved from something colder than the frost on the wire. Nobody in that yard expects the kneeling man to survive the morning. That is rather the point of standing him there at all, a lesson, dressed up as justice, meant for every human watching. By noon, the woman on the balcony is going to have learned something about mercy that 11 years of imperial education never once thought to teach her. And it is going to start with the man kneeling in the frost refusing, with his very last ounce of stubbornness, to die quietly. The wrench and chains. 3 days earlier, nobody on Corvath Station would have looked twice at Dale Kessler. That had always been rather the arrangement of his life, even before the occupation. A crew chief's job is to be invisible until something breaks, and then to be indispensable for exactly as long as it takes to fix it, and then invisible again. He had run maintenance on this station's atmospheric plant for 6 years before the Voss'Ka fleet arrived in orbit and ended. In the space of one very bad afternoon, every assumption anyone on Corvath had ever made about how the rest of their lives were going to go. He remembered that afternoon in pieces, the way you remember the worst days, not as a continuous story, but as a handful of freeze-framed details. The low, bone-deep thrum of capital ships breaching atmosphere, the settlement's old air raid siren wailing a warning system nobody had needed to use in 2 generations, his daughter's face through the reinforced glass of the shelter door, as the garrison herded families toward processing centers that everyone at the time still hoped were exactly what the occupation force called them. They had not been. 6 years of running this station's water and air had not made him a soldier, had not made him a resistance fighter, had simply made him the one man on Corvath who understood, better than anyone left alive on the station, exactly how fragile the machinery keeping several thousand people breathing actually was, and exactly how little the empire currently running it seemed to care. He was 41 years old, built low and solid the way men get who spend their careers hauling equipment through crawlspaces too narrow for anyone taller, with forearms scarred pale from decades of catching his own knuckles on machinery that had never once cared how careful he tried to be. His hair had gone gray early, a fact he blamed, half joking, on 20 years of overnight maintenance shifts rather than anything more dramatic, and there was a permanent squint to his eyes from years spent reading gauge readouts in poor light. He wore a prisoner's gray jumpsuit now instead of his old coveralls, the name patch long since torn off, but his hands still moved with the restless, searching habit of a man who is always, on some subconscious level, checking for the fault line in whatever is in front of him. A tic that had gotten him noticed by the wrong people 3 days after the surrender, When he'd been caught quietly rerouting a coolant line, the occupation garrison hadn't realized was failing. He hadn't done it out of resistance, not exactly. He'd done it because a failing coolant line in Sector 4 was going to take out the station's water reclamation with it inside a week, and Dale Kessler had never once in his life been able to walk past broken machinery and simply let it stay broken, even machinery currently being used to keep him and everyone he cared about as prisoners. There was a particular kind of stubbornness in that, one he'd never quite been able to explain to people who didn't share it. The sense that a system left to fail out of spite punished the people trapped inside it far more than it ever punished whoever happened to be in charge of it, and Dale had simply never been able to stomach the math on that trade. The garrison commander, who found him elbow-deep in a panel he had no authorization to touch, hadn't cared about his reasoning. He'd cared about the fact that a human had been caught modifying imperial infrastructure without permission, 3 days before the arrival of Princess Ilyra Vossara Kel'Thune, and had decided, with the flat efficiency of a man protecting his own career, that an example needed making before her inspection tour began. Dale had tried, in the hour of questioning that followed, to explain the failing coolant line in terms simple enough for a garrison interrogator with no engineering background to understand, and had watched, with a kind of resigned, exhausted clarity, as none of it landed at all. Some men could not be talked out of a decision they had already made for reasons that had nothing to do with the facts in front of them, and the garrison commander, it turned out, was exactly that kind of man. So Dale Kessler spent his last night as a free man in a holding cell 2 decks below the yard, listening to the station's old pipes groan the way they always had, cataloging every sound out of habit even though there was nothing left for him to fix, and thinking mostly about his daughter back on the mainland settlement, and whether anyone would ever tell her what had actually happened to him, or whether he'd simply become one more name on a list nobody kept honestly anymore. He did not sleep much. He spent a fair portion of the night doing the same mental exercise he'd done 1,000 times on difficult repair jobs, walking the whole system in his head, start to finish, tracing every junction and joint of the atmospheric plant from memory, partly to keep his mind off the morning, and partly because some old, stubborn part of him refused to stop caring about a system's health, even with his own life measured out in hours instead of years. The princess's verdict. Princess Ilyra Vossara Kel'Thune was 26 years old by Voss'Ka reckoning, 3rd in the imperial succession, and had spent her entire adult life being told, in increasingly specific detail, exactly how a conquered species was supposed to behave in her presence. She stood a full head taller than any human in the yard, violet-plated in ceremonial armor that caught the weak dawn light in sharp, deliberate lines, her pale gold eyes moving across the assembled prisoners with the flat, practiced disinterest of someone who had reviewed 1,000 garrison reports and expected this one to read exactly like the last 999. She had been raised, from her earliest memory, on a court education built almost entirely around the doctrine of imperial superiority, lessons in xenobiology that cataloged every conquered species' weaknesses before it ever bothered cataloging their strengths, tutors who had drilled into her, year after year, that mercy shown to a subject species was mercy stolen from the Empire's own stability. She had never questioned any of it particularly hard, because nobody around her ever had either, and because questioning it had never once, in her experience, changed an outcome that mattered. This was, notionally, meant to be a routine stop on a longer inspection tour. 3 days assessing garrison discipline and resource extraction on a newly pacified frontier station, nothing that should have required more than a cursory review, and a formal address to the assembled prisoner population before her convoy moved on to the next occupied world on her itinerary. She had not expected, stepping off her shuttle that morning into Corvath's frozen dawn air, that this particular stop was about to consume rather more of her attention than any of the others combined. "This is the one," her garrison commander said, gesturing at Dale with a stiff, formal bow, who tampered with sector infrastructure without authorization 3 days prior to your Grace's arrival. Given the timing and given unconfirmed reports of resistance activity in the outer settlements, the garrison recommends treating this as attempted sabotage. Ilyra's gaze settled on Dale for the first time, and he felt it land on him the way you feel a held breath, a long, cataloging pause, boots to face, the particular attention of someone deciding how much of her mourning a problem is worth. "You do not appear to be a soldier," she said, in the crisp, formal cadence of a language built without contractions, without softness, every syllable placed like a brick in a wall. "You appear to be a laborer. Explain to me why a laborer believes he has standing too. Alter systems belonging to the empire that now governs this station." "Coolant line was failing," Dale said, voice rough from the cell's cold from 3 days without much water. "Another week, maybe 2, and Sector 4's water reclamation goes down with it. That's not just my problem. That's every prisoner on this station's problem, and I'd wager some of your garrisons too, once the smell started." "You claim benevolence," Ilyra said, and something in her tone made it clear she did not believe the word applied to anything a human might be capable of. "A convenient claim, and one this station's prior inhabitants have made before, always in the moment their competence is questioned. Your species has a long, well-documented history of dressing self-interest in the language of service. Frail creatures cling to whatever leverage keeps them useful, because they understand, on some animal level, that uselessness on a conquered world is a sentence far worse than execution." "Maybe," Dale said. "Or maybe I just don't like watching things break when I know how to fix them. Either way, your coolant line's still failing, Your Grace, whether you believe me or not." Ilyra's expression did not change, but something in the set of her jaw tightened, the particular tell of someone who has just been contradicted in front of an audience and does not appreciate the sensation. "Sector infrastructure will be reviewed by qualified imperial engineers," she said, "not by a conquered laborer's unsanctioned theories. Attempted sabotage against the Empire, on the eve of a royal inspection, is not a matter this station's garrison commander requires my personal attention to resolve, and yet here you kneel before me regardless, which tells me the garrison believes an example is warranted." She turned to the commander with a flat, dismissive gesture. "Execute him at noon, publicly, before the full prisoner population. Let it be understood, on the first day of my inspection, precisely what tampering with imperial systems costs. A reprieve with conditions." The order should have been the end of it. Dale had heard enough imperial verdicts in 3 days of occupation to know that Voss'ka royalty did not often reverse itself, and certainly not for the benefit of a prisoner's protests. He knelt in the frost, chains biting into wrists gone numb an hour ago, and did the only thing left available to a condemned man. He did the math on how many hours he had left, and decided, with the same stubborn practicality that had gotten him into this mess in the first place, that he wasn't going to spend them feeling sorry for himself. The guards marched him back toward the holding cells rather than the execution block itself, some procedural formality about preparation time that Dale didn't much care to understand, and he spent the better part of the next hour doing what he always did with idle time he couldn't fix anything with: running the atmospheric plant schematics through his head one more time, tracing every junction from memory, half out of habit and half because it was easier than thinking about the alternative. He thought about telling one of the guards about the coolant line again, on the theory that a second warning might land where the first one hadn't, and decided against it. Nobody in that yard had wanted to hear it the first time. There was no reason to believe a repeat performance would land any differently, and Dale had never been a man who wasted breath on arguments he already knew he'd lose. The station's alarms began screaming at 9 minutes past the hour. It was not a subtle sound. It was the atmospheric plant's catastrophic failure klaxon, a sound Dale had heard exactly twice in 6 years of running that system, both times during genuine near misses that had come within an hour of venting half the station's breathable air into vacuum. He knew that sound the way he knew his own name, and hearing it now, kneeling in chains in the frost with a noon execution hanging over his head, every instinct he had screamed the same message at once. The coolant line he'd tried to fix 3 days ago had just finished failing completely, and Sector 4's reclamation system was about to take the atmospheric plant down with it, and nobody currently on this station's engineering staff had the faintest idea how to stop it, because he was the only person who'd actually understood that system's real architecture in 6 years. The yard dissolved into chaos, guards shouting into comms, prisoners being herded back toward barracks blocks, the garrison commander's face going the particular shade of pale that meant a man was recalculating his entire morning in real time. Voices crackled over a dozen open channels at once, half of them Voss'Ka officers barking contradictory orders, half of them human prisoners murmuring the particular low, fearful undertone of people who understand exactly what a station-wide atmospheric klaxon means and have no power at all to do anything about it. Somewhere behind the dais, a junior engineer in garrison colors was already arguing loudly with a superior about emergency shutdown protocols that Dale, even from a distance and through chains, could tell were the wrong protocols entirely. The kind of by-the-book response that worked fine for garden-variety pressure faults and did absolutely nothing for a fracture cascading through a coolant main, the way this one clearly was. Ilyra remained on the balcony, imperial poise intact even as klaxons wailed across the whole station, but Dale saw her hand tighten on the balcony rail hard enough to whiten at the knuckle, and understood, with the flat clarity of a man who has spent his whole life reading the truth off machinery rather than faces, that whatever backup plan the garrison's engineers were currently attempting, it was not going to be enough. "Your Grace," he called up, voice cracking from the cold and the strain of 3 days without proper water, "that's my system failing. I know exactly what's wrong with it, and I know exactly how long you've got before it takes your whole life support grid down with it. You can execute me at noon like you planned. Or you can unchain me right now and let me actually fix the thing I already tried to fix once, and maybe there's still a station standing by the time noon gets here for you to execute me on." The yard went very quiet, except for the klaxon and the wind, and the particular ringing silence of several thousand people simultaneously doing the same grim arithmetic Dale had just handed them. The garrison commander opened his mouth to object, some reflexive protest about protocol, about the danger of arming a prisoner with knowledge of critical systems, and closed it again just as fast, because even he understood, watching the pressure readouts on his own wrist display climb into ranges he did not have names for, that protocol was not currently the department in charge of this particular morning. Steam and screaming metal. Ilyra's reprieve came with an escort of 6 armed guards, a garrison commander whose expression suggested he expected this entire gambit to end in Dale's death regardless of the klaxon's outcome, and a set of restraints loosened just enough to let his hands work while keeping him tethered on a short lead like a dog nobody entirely trusted. It was, Dale reflected as they marched him down towards Sector 4, roughly the working conditions he'd expected from an imperial occupation from day one, and at least this time nobody was pretending otherwise. The descent took 4 minutes through corridors that grew progressively warmer and louder the closer they got, the station's old bones groaning under stress in a register Dale hadn't heard since a near-catastrophic failure 8 years earlier, back before the occupation, back when the only thing at stake in a bad shift was a repair bill instead of several thousand lives. He counted the warning signs as they passed, pressure gauges climbing into red bands, condensation beating thick on bulkheads that should have been bone dry, the particular acrid tang of superheated coolant starting to bleed into the recycled air, and felt the old, familiar tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the chains and everything to do with a system he'd spent 6 years keeping alive, now actively trying to kill everyone downstream of it. The atmospheric plant's lower access corridor hit him like a wall the moment the hatch cycled open. A wave of superheated steam venting from a ruptured coolant main, the air gone thick and scalding, visibility dropping to arm's length in a haze that turned every guard's ceremonial armor into a dim silhouette. The sound in there was its own kind of assault, a shrieking, tearing hiss underlaid by the deep structural groan of metal being asked to hold pressure it was never designed for, loud enough that Dale had to shout to be heard even standing close. Voss'Ka physiology, Dale knew from 6 years of watching garrison troops struggle through the station's warmer maintenance decks, ran cooler and drier than human biology by a wide margin. Their armor carried cooling systems for exactly this reason, and even with that armor, 2 of his 6-guard escort peeled back toward the hatch within 90 seconds, unable to tolerate the heat, and the visibility lost long enough to be useful, coughing and stumbling as their faceplates fogged over entirely, and their cooling systems whined audibly under a load they weren't built to handle. Dale went in anyway, in a soaked gray jumpsuit and nothing else, because a human body drenched in sweat and breathing steam-thick air was still, fundamentally, built to survive exactly this kind of punishing wet heat far longer than the armored soldiers flanking him. And because somewhere under the screaming of ruptured pipe and venting steam, he could hear the specific groan of metal fatigue that told him precisely which valve had gone on. Indeed, precisely how long he had before the whole main let go entirely. His own sweat came fast and heavy within seconds, running in stinging rivulets into his eyes, soaking what was left of the gray jumpsuit dark against his skin. And he let it, because that was the whole point, every drop of it carrying heat away from a body that had no other business surviving conditions like this, buying him minutes his escort simply didn't have. The primary coolant valves fused open, he shouted back through the haze, dropping to his knees beside a control panel gone slick with condensation, hands already moving over controls he'd installed himself 6 years earlier and had not touched since the occupation began. I need a secondary shutoff spun manually. That's 40 meters down this corridor, and I need it done in under 6 minutes or this whole main ruptures and takes the pressure seal on Sector 4 with it. You are chained, the remaining guard said, flat and unhelpful, Voss'Ka formality holding even through a faceplate fogged with condensation. Then unchain my hands, Dale snapped, or find me someone who can run 40 meters through this steam without passing out, because I sure as hell can't do both jobs from here. The guard who looked away. The guard's name, Dale would learn much later, was Threll, a junior officer barely older than the princess herself, assigned to this escort as punishment for some minor infraction nobody ever fully explained to him. He had the particular stiffness of a young soldier still trying to prove himself worthy of a uniform he'd only recently earned, the kind of rigid, by-the-book bearing that Dale recognized from every rookie he'd ever worked alongside back before the occupation, human or otherwise. The type who followed protocol not out of conviction, but out of fear of what happened if he didn't. Whatever the reason for his assignment, Threll made a decision in that steam-choked corridor that no amount of imperial doctrine had prepared him for. He unlocked Dale's wrist restraints himself, hands shaking slightly, glancing back once toward the hatch as if expecting the garrison commander to materialize out of the haze and countermand him on the spot. Nobody did. Dale immediately used his newly freed hands not to run, not to fight, but to yank open a service panel and start rerouting a bypass line with the calm, practiced efficiency of a man who had done exactly this kind of emergency repair 100 times before under conditions considerably less dramatic than an execution deadline. His fingers found wire housings by feel through the condensation, stripping insulation, with quick, economical motions that hadn't dulled at all in 3 days of captivity. Muscle memory carrying him through a task his conscious mind barely had bandwidth left to track over the roar of venting steam. Go, Dale said, not looking up from the panel. 40 meters, straight corridor, manual wheel valve on your left about waist height. Spin it clockwise all the way. Don't stop halfway thinking you've done enough, because you haven't. I'll hold the bypass here as long as I can. And if I cannot tolerate the heat that far in? Threll asked, and there was something almost young in the honesty of the question, none of the practiced Voss'Ka formality managing to fully mask it. Then you get as far as you can and I finish it myself, Dale said. Either way, somebody's going, and it's not going to be me standing here arguing about it. Move. The 40-meter run to the secondary shutoff fell, by default, to Dale himself, because every guard in that corridor had already proven they couldn't tolerate the heat long enough to make the sprint reliably, and there was no time left to argue about it. He went in half-blind, one hand trailing the corridor wall to keep his bearings in steam so thick it stung his eyes to open them, boots slipping on condensation-slick decking, lungs burning with air that felt more like breathing through a wet towel than breathing at all. Every few strides he counted off in his head, an old habit from years of navigating this same corridor half asleep on graveyard shifts, using the count to keep his bearings when the haze swallowed every visual landmark he might otherwise have used. 20 meters. 30. His pulse hammered loud enough in his own ears to nearly drown out the shrieking pipe behind him, and somewhere in the back of his mind, distant and almost academic, a part of him noted that a man his age with no proper conditioning left had no business running this hard through air this thin and this hot. And that part of him was entirely correct, and entirely irrelevant to the 6 minutes currently ticking down whether his body approved of the effort or not. He found the shutoff by feel as much as sight, a heavy manual wheel valve that hadn't been spun in years and fought him the entire way, rust and disuse making every quarter turn cost him skin off his palms before it finally, grudgingly, began to move. He spun it hard, using his whole body weight, shoulder braced against the wheel's spokes, breath tearing in and out of him in ragged gasps that had nothing left to do with efficiency and everything to do with simple, desperate persistence. And somewhere behind him in the haze, he heard the ruptured main screaming pitch begin slowly to drop. The moon's own teeth. It should have ended there. It very nearly did. And Dale would have counted himself lucky to walk out of that corridor with nothing worse than scalded forearms and a set of blistered palms, except that Corvath Station's lower decks had never been built with only one failure mode in mind, and the same structural stress that had ruptured the coolant main had also, in the confusion of steam and alarm, cracked open a containment seal on the station's lower access shaft. The shaft that led down into the old mining tunnels beneath the original settlement, tunnels that generations of Corvath colonists had learned, the hard way, to keep permanently sealed. Dale had heard the stories about that shaft his whole tenure on the station, half-believed rumors passed down from the original survey crews, about things living in the deep rock that nobody had ever bothered to properly document. The kind of story a maintenance crew tells itself to explain why a particular hatch gets an extra lock nobody talks about openly. The thing that came up out of that shaft moved low and fast through the steam, drawn by heat and vibration, and the general chaos of alarms it had certainly never heard before. A pale, chitinous burrower the length of a shuttle bus, mandibles clicking with a wet, rhythmic sound that cut through even the hiss of venting steam. Its body moved in a low, undulating ripple, dozens of stubby legs finding purchase on wet decking, with a speed that looked wrong for something its size, and the ambient heat pouring off the ruptured main seemed to draw it forward rather than repel it, as if it had mistaken the whole corridor for some deep-earth thermal vent it recognized from instinct alone. It had never seen a human before. It had certainly never seen a Voss'Ka soldier, and its first instinct, confronted with two entirely unfamiliar prey species in the same disorienting few seconds, was simply to attack whatever moved closest. That happened to be Threll, still frozen at the panel Dale had abandoned, faceplate fogged, armor doing nothing to help him track a threat moving through zero visibility by vibration alone. Dale saw the shape of it coming through the haze a half-second before it reached the guard, and did not think, did not calculate, did not weigh the fact that this particular soldier had, an hour earlier, been prepared to march him to his own execution. He simply moved, shoulder-checking Threll sideways out of the burrower's strike path, and taking the glancing edge of a mandible across his own ribs instead, a tearing, white-hot line of pain that dropped him hard onto the slick decking with blood already soaking fast through soaked gray cotton. For a moment the whole corridor narrowed down to nothing but the pain and the ringing in his ears, the world gone white at the edges the way it does when a body takes a wound too large for it to fully process all at once. He heard, distantly, Threll shouting something in Voss'Ka he didn't have the bandwidth to translate, heard the burrower's mandibles clicking as it reoriented itself for a second strike, and understood, with the same flat, practical clarity that had carried him through every crisis of his life, that lying still on that decking bleeding was the one option that guaranteed he wouldn't see noon at all, execution or otherwise. He did not have a weapon. He had a multi-tool from a maintenance kit he'd grabbed on the way down, and the vague, half-formed idea that a burrower adapted to hunting by vibration in total darkness might respond very differently to a sudden, concentrated burst of ultrasonic feedback than it would to anything resembling a conventional attack. An idea he tested, bleeding and half-blind. By jamming the multi-tool's diagnostic pickup directly against the ruptured pipe's still venting steam valve, and cranking the frequency output as high as the tool would go. The burrower reared back with a shriek that cracked something in Dale's own eardrums, disoriented by a sound its entire hunting sense had never been built to filter out, and gave him and Threll both the handful of seconds they needed to drag themselves clear before it retreated, confused and furious, back down into the shaft it had come from. A blade laid at his feet. Threll knelt beside him in the settling steam, faceplate finally cleared enough to show an expression Dale had not expected to see on any Voss'Ka soldier's face, something raw and young, and entirely unrehearsed. His hands still trembled slightly, whether from the burrower's shriek still ringing in his ears or from the sheer improbability of what just happened. Dale couldn't tell and didn't much care to guess. He unclasped the ceremonial sidearm from his own belt, standard issue for garrison escorts, a short, honor-marked blade rather than a functional weapon, and laid it flat across both palms, extending it toward Dale in a gesture that Dale did not understand the significance of until much later, when someone finally explained that among Voss'Ka soldiers, surrendering one's honor blade to another was reserved for exactly one circumstance: acknowledging a debt of life that could not otherwise be repaid. "You are bleeding badly," Threll said, voice unsteady in a way his formal Voss'Ka syntax couldn't quite disguise. "The valve is holding. The secondary line is stable. I do not know the protocol for what you have just done, laborer. I do not believe there is a protocol for it." "There's a protocol for that too, Your Grace," Dale started to say, then caught himself, huffing out something that was half laugh and half wince as pain lanced through his side. "Sorry, not Your Grace. Force of habit, apparently, even with a hole in my ribs." He pressed a torn strip of his own sleeve hard against the wound in his side, breath coming short and wet in a way he didn't love the sound of. "There's a protocol. It's called not letting something get eaten if you can help it. Doesn't matter much whose side they're on, when the thing coming at them doesn't care either." Threll did not withdraw the blade. He held it there, extended, until Dale finally reached out with a blood-slicked hand and closed his fingers over the hilt, more out of a sense that refusing seemed like it would insult the kid than any real understanding of what he'd just accepted. Above them, on the access ladder leading back up toward the yard, Princess Ilyra Vossara Kel'Thune stood in the hatchway with an expression that had, in the space of 11 minutes, traveled a very long distance from where it had started that morning, watching a bleeding, chained no longer laborer she had ordered executed by noon get shoulder-checked by gratitude from one of her own soldiers instead. She had come down herself rather than sending an aide, drawn by the same alarm reports that had brought the burrower's presence to her attention. And what she found at the bottom of that ladder was not the picture of a resentful, dangerous prisoner her garrison commander's report had painted at dawn. It was a man bleeding on the deck of a station he had saved twice in the space of a single morning, being handed an honor he had no idea the value of by a soldier who, 6 hours earlier, would have marched him to his death without a second thought. The second assassin. It was Ilyra herself, reviewing the plant's damage logs an hour later, while Dale sat under guard getting his ribs field-dressed by a medic who clearly had no idea how human anatomy worked and was improvising, who noticed the detail that turned an infrastructure failure into something considerably more dangerous. She had insisted on the review personally rather than delegating it, a decision that surprised her own staff nearly as much as it would have surprised her that morning's version of herself, and she worked through the data with the same meticulous, unhurried attention her tutors had drilled into her for reviewing garrison reports. Except this time, she found herself looking for something other than confirmation of what she already expected to find. The coolant main's rupture pattern did not match ordinary metal fatigue. It matched precisely a stress fracture deliberately seeded along a weld seam months earlier, old enough to have been placed well before the occupation even began, patient enough to have been timed to fail on almost exactly the week of her arrival, and sophisticated enough that only someone with detailed knowledge of both the station's original engineering and her own inspection schedule could have planned it. She pulled up the fracture's growth curve, a projection any competent engineer would have recognized instantly, and felt a slow, cold certainty settle over her as the timeline aligned, almost to the day, with the announcement of her tour 6 months prior. She pulled the maintenance access logs going back 8 months and found the signature she had, on some buried level, already suspected she would find. Garrison Commander Voss'Ka Empire, the same officer who had recommended Dale's execution that morning, who had authorized a maintenance access request to Sector 4's coolant main 8 months prior under a routine inspection order that, on closer review, no routine inspection schedule had ever actually called for. She cross-checked the request against Threndel's own personnel file and found, buried 3 layers deep in a service record otherwise unremarkable, a distant familial connection to House Vesseline, the same rival branch of the imperial family that had spent a decade quietly agitating against her succession. Threndel et earned out, belonged to a faction within the imperial court that had spent a decade arguing against Ilyra's succession, favoring a rival branch of the family that saw the empire's expansion policy as too slow, too cautious, too inclined toward integration rather than outright subjugation of conquered worlds. A failed inspection tour, ending in the death of a young princess in a catastrophic infrastructure accident on a backwater-occupied station, would have been, for that faction, an almost perfectly deniable outcome, tragic, embarrassing, and entirely blamable on the incompetence of a garrison staff overseeing a resentful conquered population. Blaming a human prisoner for sabotage in the hours before the failure would have simply been the final, tidy piece of misdirection, ensuring that whatever inquiry followed her death looked everywhere except at the man who had actually planted the fracture. It was, she had to admit even through her rising fury, an almost elegant piece of work, nothing that would ever trace back to a signature under casual review, nothing that would survive scrutiny as anything but tragic coincidence stacked upon tragic coincidence, precisely the kind of plausible deniability a career officer with patient family backing would know exactly how to construct. Ilyra sat with that data for a long moment, feeling something colder than the station's morning frost settle into her chest, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only from nearly dying, that the laborer she had ordered executed at noon had spent the last hour of his life saving hers from a threat his own execution had been deliberately timed to help disguise. She thought of her own morning verdict, the flat certainty with which she dismissed his claim of benevolence as a convenient lie, and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had absolutely nothing clever or formal to say about how thoroughly she had been wrong. The valve that saved a princess. There was, however, one final problem, and it was Dale, still bleeding, still exhausted, propped against a bulkhead with a medic's improvised dressing wound too tight around his ribs, who spotted it first, reading the plant's residual pressure readouts over the shoulder of a guard who had, by that point, stopped bothering to keep him at arm's length. The numbers scrolling across the display told a story he'd read 100 times before in one form or another. A system that had survived its first crisis only by shifting the load somewhere it hadn't been designed to carry it, buying time rather than solving anything, the way a cracked bone splinted wrong can hold weight for a little while before it doesn't. Your secondary shutoff's holding, he said, but it's holding on a valve that was never rated for the load it's carrying right now. Threndel's fracture didn't just compromise the primary main. It shifted stress onto every downstream junction in that system, and the one holding your whole plant together at the moment is about 40 minutes from failing the exact same way the first one did, except this time you won't have a working primary line left to reroute around. Then repair it, Ilyra said, arriving at the medical bay with a speed that startled the two guards standing watch, imperial poise fraying at the edges in a way Dale suspected did not happen often in front of witnesses. Her formal cadence had not entirely deserted her, but there was an edge of something underneath it now, urgent and unpolished, that hadn't been there at dawn. I can't repair a fracture like that with what's on this station. What I can do is bleed the load somewhere it won't matter. He was already pushing himself upright against the medic's protests, one hand braced hard against his ribs, breath hissing through his teeth at the movement. There's an old mining shaft under Sector 4, the same one your burrower came out of. It's been sealed for decades, which means it's been sitting there building up its own pressure differential the whole time. If I vent the plant's excess load down into that shaft, instead of trying to hold it in a junction that was never built for it, the shaft eats the overpressure the same way a shock absorber eats a bad landing. Ugly, not elegant, but it buys you time to do a proper rebuild instead of losing the whole plant in 40 minutes. The burrower, Threll said carefully, still favoring one side where the creature's earlier strike had caught his armor a glancing blow, is still down there. Yeah, Dale said, it is, which is why I need someone running that valve topside while I'm down in that shaft manually opening the vent line, because the automated system doesn't have a way to target that specific junction without someone physically overriding it at the source. He looked up at Ilyra, gray-faced, blood-soaked, entirely too tired to dress the request up in anything resembling diplomacy. Your Grace, I already spent one EXC. Cushion deadline fixing your station this morning. I'm not thrilled about the idea of doing it twice in the same day, and I would very much appreciate it if you'd let Threll come down there with me, instead of standing around waiting to see if the second attempt kills me. Ilyra looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since the yard at dawn, something in her expression had shifted entirely away from the flat, cataloging contempt she'd worn when she first looked down at him from the balcony. There was calculation in her eyes still, but it had turned inward, weighing not whether to trust him but how much of her own court's doctrine she was going to have to quietly discard once this day was finished. Go, she said, both of you. And laborer, when this is finished, you and I are going to have a considerably longer conversation than the one we had this morning. Looking forward to it, Dale said, in a tone that suggested he was not, in fact, looking forward to anything except lying down, and let Threll haul him upright by the good arm. The vent took 11 minutes, most of it spent with Dale wedged into a service crawlspace forcing a corroded manual override open by hand, while Threll stood guard at the shaft mouth with a weapon. he clearly hoped he wouldn't need. Listening to the low, distant scrabble of something large moving through rock somewhere below them, and trying not to think too hard about how close it might be getting. Dale worked in the cramped dark mostly by feel, his cracked ribs screaming in protest every time the crawlspace forced him to twist at an angle his body no longer wanted to manage, sweat and old blood mixing on his hands, until the override wheel finally gave way beneath his grip with a shriek of long-seized metal. He heard the pressure differential equalize with a deep, muffled whoomp that traveled up through the rock and into his bones, felt the air pressure in the crawlspace shift as the overload finally had somewhere legitimate to go, and allowed himself, for just a moment, to simply lie still against the cold stone and breathe. When the plant's pressure readouts finally settled into a stable, sustainable range, the klaxon that had been screaming across Corvath Station for the better part of 2 hours finally, mercifully, fell silent. The mercy of noon. Noon arrived exactly on schedule, the pale sun climbing to its low winter zenith over a yard that had, by that point, filled again with prisoners and guards both, drawn by rumor of an execution that everyone now understood was not, in fact, going to happen the way it had been ordered that morning. The frost that had rimed the razor wire at dawn had mostly burned off by then, the yard's rock and gravel gone dark and damp under the thin winter sun, and there was a different quality to the silence than there had been 6 hours earlier. Less the held-breath dread of an execution crowd, more the uncertain, cautious quiet of people who had learned, over 3 days of occupation, not to trust good news until it had actually finished happening. Princess Ilyra Vossara Kel'Thune stood on the same dais where Dale had knelt in chains 6 hours earlier, though this time he stood beside it rather than beneath it, ribs bound tight under a borrowed guard's jacket, one arm in a sling, looking considerably worse for wear and entirely unbothered by the fact. Threll stood a pace behind him, still in his own singed and steam-damaged armor, occupying a position that no one had explicitly assigned him, but that nobody seemed inclined to question either. "At dawn," she said, addressing the yard in the carrying, formal cadence of a public verdict, "I ordered this man's execution for the crime of tampering with imperial systems without authorization. By noon, that same tampering, and the 6 hours of additional labor he performed afterward, unchained, unarmed, and under no obligation beyond his own stubborn refusal to watch a system fail when he understood how to fix it, is the only reason this station's atmospheric plant is still functioning, and the only reason I am still alive to deliver this verdict at all." She paused, letting the weight of that land across a yard gone entirely silent, guards and prisoners alike straining to hear every word. Garrison Commander Vosh Threndel has been taken into custody for deliberate sabotage and attempted regicide. The investigation into how deeply that conspiracy extends will not be brief, and it will not, I promise this yard, be quiet. She turned to Dale, and the yard went very quiet, the particular silence of several thousand people uncertain which direction the next sentence was going to break. "I do not know the correct imperial protocol for reversing a death sentence within the same day it was issued," she said, more quietly now, close enough that only Dale and the nearest guards could hear it clearly. "There has never, to my knowledge, been cause to develop one. My tutors spent a great many hours teaching me the language of imperial superiority, laborer. Not one of those years included a lesson in what to say to a man who has saved my life twice before lunch." "There's a protocol for that too, Your Grace," Dale said, wincing as he shifted his weight off the ribs that had earned him the sling. "It's called saying you were wrong, and then maybe getting the guy some proper food, because prison rations and near death by superheated steam do not mix well, and I have genuinely not eaten anything I'd call a meal in 3 days." Something crossed Ilyra's face that might, on a species with less rigid court training, have been the beginning of a laugh. "I believe," she said, "that can be arranged." She raised her voice again, addressing the yard, the guards, the watching prisoners, in the formal cadence of a verdict that both sides understood was not, this time, going to end in anyone's death. Let it be recorded that on this station on this day, mercy was not granted as weakness. It was earned in full by a laborer this empire underestimated at dawn and will not underestimate again. Let it further be recorded that Corvath Station's prisoner population will, effective immediately, be granted status as recognized labor partners rather than conquered subjects, a distinction that carries, among other privileges, the right to refuse an order that endangers their own lives without facing summary judgment for it. A murmur ran through the assembled prisoners at that, low and disbelieving at first, then rising into something that was not quite a cheer. Nobody in that yard had yet learned to trust good news enough for cheering, but was, at the very least, the sound of several thousand people allowing themselves, cautiously, to hope. Dale Kessler, 41 years old, bruised, scalded, bleeding through a borrowed jacket, and entirely too tired to appreciate the historical weight of the moment, mostly just wanted his lunch, and said so, quietly, to Threll, who had the good grace not to laugh out loud in front of his own princess, though it was, by his own later admission, a close thing. "You saved a princess's life today," Threll murmured, helping him down off the dais with careful, deliberate steps. "Twice, by my count. Most soldiers in this empire will go their entire careers without doing that once." "Most soldiers in this empire," Dale said, "probably get a hot meal without having to negotiate an execution reversal for it first. I'd trade the historical footnote for a sandwich right about now, kid, and I mean that with total sincerity." He did, eventually, get his sandwich, a strange, dense imperial ration bar that Ilyra's own kitchen staff apologized for at length, explaining that Corvath Station supply lines had never been built with human dietary needs in mind, a fact Dale found he had absolutely no energy left to be annoyed about. He ate it sitting on a supply crate in the medical bay, ribs freshly resplinted by a human doctor finally allowed proper access to the prisoner infirmary, and found, somewhere between the second bite and the third, that his hands had finally stopped shaking for the first time since dawn. If a princess can go from ordering an execution to asking a prisoner's forgiveness in 6 hours flat, maybe the lesson here isn't about aliens at all. It's about what happens when somebody finally bothers to look past the uniform and actually watch what a person does under pressure. Let me know in the comments whether you'd have made that run through the steam. Hit like and subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and share it with someone who's ever been judged before anyone bothered to actually watch them work.